Claire had always believed that if her marriage ended, it would be after long, difficult conversations, perhaps tears, and at least a shred of decency. Instead, the moment arrived in the form of a cruel, thoughtless text message in the middle of her workday. Between assisting customers at her boutique, she glanced at her phone and read the words that shattered 12 years of marriage. "I'm leaving you and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account." Haha. It was the kind of message designed to humiliate, to wound, to break someone. But Claire didn't break. She didn't gasp, didn't cry, didn't even let her hands tremble as she helped Mrs. Peterson pick out a scarf. The only sign of her emotions was a slight tightening around her eyes, a flicker of something unreadable. She had seen this coming, of course. The late nights at the office that didn't match his paycheck, the sudden obsession with the gym, the expensive dinners he had no explanation for. She had known for months, maybe even longer, that Mark was slipping away. No, not slipping, running. And yet, he had assumed she would be blindsided. That she would crumble under the weight of his betrayal. That she would beg. Instead, Claire finished her workday as usual, locking up her boutique with the same confidence she had every evening. She didn't respond to his message, nor did she react with the devastation he likely expected. Let him gloat over his supposed victory. Let him believe he had won. What Mark didn't know was that Claire had been preparing for this moment for months. And she was ready. Claire had always trusted her instincts. It was that quiet, nagging voice in the back of her mind that told her when something wasn't right, the same intuition that had guided her in business and in life. And for months, maybe even years, that voice had been whispering about Mark. At first, she tried to ignore it, to push aside the creeping doubts. Marriages went through rough patches, didn't they? Work got stressful. People changed. But deep down, she knew. She had known the night he came home late, reeking of expensive cologne he never wore for her. She had known when he started going to the gym religiously, his sudden interest in fitness coinciding a little too neatly with his growing emotional distance. And she had definitely known when she found a restaurant receipt dinner for two at a place far outside their usual budget on a night he had claimed to be working late. That night, she didn't confront him. No screaming, no accusations, no crying. Instead, she went to her laptop and opened a new bank account. Then, with the precision of a woman who had spent years balancing business finances, she began quietly moving her personal savings. A week later, when Mark suggested they merge their accounts to simplify things, she smiled and agreed, knowing full well that the money he thought they shared was only a fraction of what she truly had. The little changes continued. The sudden secrecy with his phone. The laughter that came too easily when he texted late at night. The way he had started talking about her business, not with admiration, but with thinly veiled condescension. Your little shop. A hobby, in his mind. A side project. Never something real. And then, the final sign. The new receptionist at his office, Melissa. Claire had met her at the Christmas party. Young. Beautiful. Naive. She had seen the way Melissa looked at Mark, the way she touched his arm when she thought no one was watching. Claire had been watching. When she found the hotel charges on their credit card statement 2 months ago, she didn't scream or break down. She simply took screenshots. Evidence. Cold, hard proof of what she already knew. That same day, she consulted a lawyer. Quietly, calmly, she prepared for the inevitable. So when Mark's text arrived, "I'm leaving you, moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend," I've already emptied our joint account. Haha. It didn't break her. It didn't even surprise her. She had been waiting. She smiled as she typed her response. Not with sadness, not with anger, but with something dangerously close to amusement. Good luck. That was it. No begging, no bargaining. While Mark was likely celebrating his grand escape, imagining her devastated and lost, Claire was calmly locking up her boutique for the night. The reality was far more brutal than he could have imagined. He thought he had won. But Claire wasn't the fool he had mistaken her for. She was the storm he never saw coming. Claire took a slow sip of wine, letting the rich taste linger on her tongue. The bottle had been waiting for a special occasion, and this moment certainly qualified. Mark thought he had outplayed her, thought he had executed the perfect escape, running off with a woman half his age, emptying their joint bank account, and sending her the most callous goodbye in history. He had imagined her devastated, crying, shattered. But he didn't know. He had no idea. She set the glass down and picked up her phone. Another text from Mark. Don't bother begging. Melissa and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later. Her lips curled into a slow smile. He was so sure of himself. So sure she was powerless. With practiced ease, she forwarded his message to her lawyer, adding it to the growing file of his arrogance. The file that contained every piece of evidence she had been collecting for months: hotel receipts, restaurant bills, credit card charges. The file that would make sure he didn't just lose a marriage. He would lose everything. And then came the final, perfect mistake. By the way, I used the joint card to book our flights and hotel. Consider it my parting gift. LOL. The laugh. The arrogance. The sheer stupidity. Claire's fingers danced across the screen as she dialed the credit card company. Fraudulent charges. 2 first-class tickets to Miami. A luxury hotel stay. All paid for with their joint account. Except, Mark had just admitted in writing that those purchases weren't for them. The credit card representative's voice was carefully professional, but Claire could hear the amusement beneath the surface. We'll cancel the charges immediately, ma'am. Would you like to remove Mr. Harrison as an authorized user? She barely suppressed a laugh. Yes. Do it now. By morning, Mark and Melissa would arrive at the airport, flushed with excitement for their new life together, only to find out their tickets were invalid. Their hotel reservation? Gone. No more luxury suite. No more grand escape. Just an empty departure gate and a very expensive lesson in underestimating the wrong woman. Claire didn't even bother responding to his messages after that. Let him figure it out. Let him stew in the consequences of his arrogance. But the best part was yet to come. At noon, her phone buzzed again. It wasn't Mark, this time it was his mother. Claire, dear, Barbara's voice was thick with judgment. Mark told us everything. How you were cold. Controlling. How you're being vindictive now, causing trouble with his travel plans. Claire smirked, pressing the phone to her ear as she adjusted a new handbag display in her boutique. Did he mention that he emptied our joint account? Silence. Then a hesitant, well, he said you left him no choice. That you've been distant. Barbara, Claire said, voice smooth as silk, I have his texts. Would you like me to read them to you? The one where he laughed about taking our money? Or the one where he mocked my age? Another pause. Then, quieter this time, he did seem a bit cruel. Cruel. That was one word for it. Stupid was another. By late afternoon, the gossip had spread. Mark and Melissa, stranded in a budget motel near the airport, desperately trying to book new flights with credit cards that had already been maxed out. Apparently, Mark had been living beyond his means for months, something Claire had long suspected. Now, he was discovering that love didn't pay the bills. And then, the final cherry on top. Her lawyer called. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday. Given his admission of emptying the joint account, and the documented credit card fraud, we're in a strong position to freeze all remaining assets. Claire smiled. Mark thought he had won. He had no idea. She had just started playing. The courtroom was colder than Claire expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. A sterile, calculated space where emotions meant nothing, and only facts mattered. And today, the facts were on her side. Mark sat across the room, his once confident smirk replaced by a tight, nervous expression. He had dressed for the occasion, probably thinking a designer blazer would give him an air of credibility. But no expensive clothing could hide the desperation in his eyes. The man who had once mocked Claire, who had laughed as he drained their joint account, who had believed himself invincible, was finally realizing the truth. He had lost. Her lawyer spoke with precision, presenting each piece of evidence methodically. The hotel receipts, the restaurant bills, the text messages. Every moment of Mark's betrayal was laid bare for the judge to see. And then, the final nail in the coffin, the gleeful text message where he bragged about using their joint credit card to book a trip with his girlfriend. The judge didn't even try to hide his disapproval. "Mr. Harrison," he said, voice level but firm, "you admitted via text to emptying a joint account and using shared credit for personal expenses. Do you deny this?" Mark swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his too-tight blazer. I was just trying to make a clean break." The judge raised an eyebrow. "By committing financial fraud?" Silence. Mark's lawyer, clearly exhausted from trying to salvage a sinking ship, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges some rash decisions, but Mrs. Harrison's actions have been calculating and vindictive." Claire's lawyer barely concealed a smirk. "You mean prudent?" she countered smoothly. "My client protected her separate assets and maintained meticulous financial records." "That's not vindictive, that's smart business." The judge nodded, flipping through the documents. "The house is in Mrs. Harrison's name only," he noted. "The business was established before the marriage, and financial records show a clear separation of business and marital funds." Mark's lawyer made one last, desperate attempt. "But the business grew during their marriage. My client is entitled to a portion." Claire's lawyer didn't even hesitate. "And we have extensive documentation showing that Mr. Harrison contributed nothing to that growth. In fact, he dismissed the boutique as a hobby and made no financial investments. The business remains separate property under the law." Claire didn't even need to look at Mark to know his expression. The slow, dawning horror of a man who thought he was about to walk away with half of everything she had built only to realize he was leaving with nothing. "The court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct," the judge announced, closing the file with finality. "All shared assets are frozen pending final dissolution." Mr. Harrison is ordered to return any funds removed from joint accounts within 24 hours. Mark bolted upright in his seat. But that money's gone. We spent it on. The judge didn't even let him finish. Then I suggest you find a way to replace it. It was over. Outside the courthouse, Claire stepped into the crisp afternoon air, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of Mark's voice, desperate, pleading. You said we'd start fresh in Miami, he was saying to Melissa. Claire didn't slow her stride, but she caught the edge of Melissa's sharp reply. Yeah? Well, I didn't sign up for this. By the time Claire reached her car, her phone buzzed. A message from her lawyer. Mark has been officially served. He's frozen out of all remaining accounts. She exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. He had thought he was orchestrating his grand escape. Instead, he had walked straight into a trap of his own making. The next few weeks passed in a blur of headlines and whispered gossip. Mark had to move in with his parents, his Miami dream reduced to the childhood bedroom he had left decades ago. He tried to claim he was a victim, but the court's ruling left little room for sympathy. His financial recklessness had consequences, and for once, he had to face them alone. Meanwhile, Claire's boutique thrived. If anything, business had boomed. Local women, many of whom had experienced their own versions of Mark, showed their support in droves, purchasing more than they needed, spreading the word. The boutique wasn't just a store anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience. One afternoon, Mark's sister, Amanda, walked into the boutique. Claire was surprised Amanda had sided with Mark in the beginning, believing his sob story. But today, her expression was different. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Amanda said, running her fingers over a silk scarf. He made us all believe you were the bad guy. But after everything, after seeing the texts, I'm ashamed we ever believed him. Claire studied her for a moment, then nodded. I appreciate that. As Amanda left, Claire turned her attention back to her work. There were shipments to sort, employees to train, new expansions to plan. Life moved forward. And Mark? Mark had destroyed himself. She had simply made sure he couldn't destroy her too. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Claire's boutique had expanded to a second location. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Mark struggled to rebuild his life from the ashes of his own making, the little shop he had belittled was thriving beyond anything he could have imagined. Business was booming. She had hired 3 new employees, launched an online store, and started receiving inquiries from national retailers. What had once been a single boutique was now evolving into a brand. And yet, despite everything, news of Mark's downfall still trickled back to her through mutual acquaintances. It wasn't pretty. His Miami escape had been short-lived, if it could even be called that. The moment he realized his tickets had been cancelled, his hotel reservation voided, and his financial accounts frozen, his grand plan had unraveled like cheap thread. He had scrambled to book new flights, only to discover his personal credit cards were already maxed out. Melissa had stuck around for a while. But reality had a way of dulling the shine of illicit romance. Living in a cramped studio apartment with a 45-year-old man who had no job prospects and no money wasn't exactly the glamorous escape she had envisioned. She had been young, naive, and flattered by his attention. But once the illusion shattered, it didn't take long for her to leave. By the time Claire heard the next update, Mark had moved back in with his parents. At 45 years old, He was sleeping in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded sports posters from his teenage years. She could only imagine the humiliation. It wasn't just his personal life that had crumbled, his career had taken a nosedive as well. The company he had once worked for had launched an internal investigation into his relationship with Melissa. It turned out that sleeping with a subordinate wasn't exactly a path to promotion. Instead of climbing the corporate ladder, he had been formally reprimanded, and when the company underwent restructuring, he was one of the first to be let go. Desperate, he had filed a complaint, claiming age discrimination. His former employers had simply added it to his file. "You should have seen his face," Amanda, his sister, had told Claire when she unexpectedly visited the boutique one afternoon. He really thought he was about to get sympathy. But HR didn't care. They just saw a middle-aged guy who got caught breaking company policy. Claire had simply nodded, listening but not reacting. She had no pity for Mark. He had dug his own grave, she had just handed him the shovel. She heard more, of course. Through mutual acquaintances, through whispers in social circles. Mark had tried to rebuild his life through dating apps, but women his age weren't interested in a man who lived with his parents, and younger women, having heard the gossip, steered clear. Even Melissa, the girl he had risked everything for, had publicly distanced herself. She had shared screenshots of his desperate attempts to win her back, his pitiful messages begging for another chance. She had been his grand prize, his proof that he was still young, still desirable. And yet, she had moved on to someone her own age without so much as a second thought. Meanwhile, Claire's success only continued to grow. Her boutique's online store was gaining national traction. A well-known business magazine reached out for an interview, not about her divorce, but about how she had built something real. They wanted to feature her as a savvy businesswoman, not a scorned wife. That was what Mark had never understood. He had thought he was taking something from her. That by leaving, by humiliating her, by draining their joint account, he was winning. He had imagined her broken, lost, begging for him to come back. Instead, he had made her stronger. One afternoon, as she was organizing inventory, her assistant walked in with a framed package. "We had this made for you," the young woman said with a grin. Inside the frame was a printed screenshot. Mark's last text before she had blocked him. "Have fun with your little shop. At least it'll keep you busy in your old age." Claire laughed. Really, truly laughed. She hung it in her office, right below her most recent business award. A reminder. Not of heartbreak, but of just how wrong he had been. 6 months ago, Mark had believed he was the one leaving her behind. Now, he was the one stuck in the past, trapped in the ruins of his own arrogance. And Claire? She was just getting started. A year after her world had supposedly fallen apart, Claire stood in the grand opening of her third boutique location, the air buzzing with excitement. She watched as customers browsed the carefully curated collection, her employees moving effortlessly through the space, offering styling advice and ringing up sales. The atmosphere was warm, elegant, and filled with possibility, the very essence of what she had worked so hard to build. She sipped a glass of champagne, letting the bubbles dance on her tongue as she took it all in. This wasn't just another store. It was a statement. Proof that she had not only survived, but thrived. She glanced across the boutique and saw a familiar face standing hesitantly near a display of handbags. Melissa. It had been a while since Claire had last heard anything about her, but she had assumed the girl had moved on. She looked younger than ever, or maybe Claire just felt that much stronger. Melissa hesitated, then walked over. I owe you an apology, she said quietly, clutching her purse like a shield. I believed everything he told me, how you were cold, controlling, how you didn't support his dreams. She sighed. And then I watched him try the same tactics on me. The moment things got tough, he wanted me to fix it. Claire studied her, but there was no resentment in her gaze. Only understanding. Those weren't dreams, Melissa, she said. They were escapes. There's a difference. Melissa nodded. I see that now. She glanced around, her eyes taking in the boutique's success. He told me once that this place was just a hobby. That you spent too much time here instead of focusing on your marriage. She let out a small laugh. I guess we both know how wrong he was. Claire smiled. Let me guess, he had big plans, but no way to fund them? Melissa exhaled sharply. Exactly. Everything was going to work out once his investments paid off. Once he got that promotion. Once his cryptocurrency skyrocketed. She shook her head. I'm dating someone my own age now. We don't have much, but at least we're building something real. Claire took another sip of champagne, feeling a deep, settled kind of satisfaction. Not just from Melissa's words, but from everything around her. The boutique, the people, the life she had built. After Melissa left, her assistant manager approached with a curious look. Was that the girlfriend? Claire shook her head, glancing toward a young couple examining a display of designer handbags. No, she said thoughtfully. That was just another woman who learned the same lesson I did. There had been so many lessons over the past year. Lessons about love, betrayal, strength, and resilience. About the way life had a funny way of circling back, revealing truths you hadn't seen before. Her lawyer had updated her that morning with the latest Mark-related news. He had filed yet another petition to revisit the divorce settlement. The judge dismissed it immediately and ordered him to pay court costs. Claire had smiled at the message but hadn't lingered on it. Mark wasn't her story anymore. Her life had moved forward. Months passed, and the boutique continued to flourish. She mentored young entrepreneurs, teaching them how to protect their assets, how to separate business from personal life, how to prepare. People stopped asking her about her divorce, and instead, they asked her about her expansion plans, her strategies, her vision. She had become an inspiration. Not for surviving Mark but for succeeding despite him. On the 5-year anniversary of her first boutique's opening, she stood before a crowd of employees, customers, and friends, giving a small speech about how far they had come. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mark's mother, Barbara, standing near the back. Claire hadn't invited her, but she wasn't surprised to see her there. After the event, Barbara approached her, looking more polished than the last time they had spoken. She was wearing a dress Claire recognized from the boutique. I saw Mark yesterday, she said, smoothing the fabric of her sleeves. He was talking about his glory days, about the life he could have had. She exhaled heavily. He still doesn't understand. He didn't lose everything in the divorce. He threw it away. Claire didn't respond right away. She simply looked around at her store, her employees, the shelves stocked with carefully selected merchandise, the glowing sign above the register that bore her name. I know, she finally said. But that's not my problem anymore. Barbara gave her a long look, then nodded. No, I suppose it isn't. As she walked away, Claire turned back to the young saleswoman she had recently hired, coincidentally also named Melissa, and listened as she excitedly explained a new inventory system she had developed. Claire caught a glimpse of her reflection in the store window. She saw what Mark had failed to see years ago. Not a woman getting older. A woman getting stronger. A woman getting better. 2 years had passed since Mark's cruel text message. 2 years since he had laughed at her, since he had assumed she would be crushed under the weight of his betrayal. He had imagined her alone, broken, desperate. Instead, Claire stood before a packed audience at a women's business conference, speaking not about heartbreak, but about success. She took a steady breath, looking out at the sea of faces: young entrepreneurs, business owners, women who had fought their own battles and were searching for wisdom, for guidance, for proof that they could rise above the setbacks life threw at them. "The best protection is preparation," she said, her voice even, confident. "And always trust your instincts." A woman in the audience raised her hand hesitantly. "My husband says I'm being paranoid for wanting to keep my business finances separate. He says marriage means sharing everything." Claire smiled. "My ex-husband said the same thing," she replied. "Right up until he tried to take half my business in our divorce." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but Claire's expression remained composed. Trust your instincts. Protection isn't paranoia. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, but she had learned. And now, standing on that stage, she wasn't just a woman who had survived betrayal, she was proof that resilience, intelligence, and careful planning could turn even the most painful experiences into stepping stones towards something greater. Her boutique chain had grown to 5 locations. The little shop that Mark had mocked now employed over 30 people and had been featured in several national magazines. Her online store was flourishing. She was no longer just a boutique owner, she was a brand. Through mutual acquaintances, she still heard about Mark. He had finally moved out of his parents' house into a tiny apartment above a garage. His once promising career had dwindled after his reckless behavior cost him his job. His reputation had never quite recovered. Melissa, ironically, had become a regular customer at Claire's original boutique. She had gone back to school, earned a business degree, and started her own social media consulting company. One day, while browsing for a dress, she had looked up at Claire and said, "You inspired me. You showed me that a woman can build something instead of falling for empty promises." Claire had simply nodded. She had nothing to prove. The proof was all around her. Back in her office, a framed screenshot still hung on the wall, Mark's final text, before she had blocked him. "Have fun with your little shop. At least it'll keep you busy in your old age." Below it, a new plaque gleamed, commemorating her latest business award. Sometimes, she thought about what Mark had said. About how he had expected her to crumble. About how he had assumed he was writing the end of her story. Instead, he had written the beginning of something far greater. And she had never looked back.